You're listening to the Autism Weekly podcast. Each week we share community voices and bring light to stories that increase awareness, acceptance, equity, access, and inclusion. If you haven't already, subscribe to join the Autism Weekly family. I'm your host, Jeff Skibitsky. This week we're joined by Dr. Daniel Vogt, a leading researcher in the field of autism spectrum disorder. Dr. Vogt's work focuses on understanding the genetic and cellular aspects of autism, which can be incredibly valuable for parents and caregivers looking to support their children effectively. Join us as we delve into this fascinating world of research and learn how it can make a positive impact on the lives of children with autism and their families. Dr. Vogt, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome. Appreciate you having me.
Well, we're excited to talk about this subject because, quite frankly, there's a lot that I need to learn through this. And I think that there's a lot that maybe as clinicians, as family members, that we can start using a little bit more effectively and immerse into our understanding of treatment models. But before we get into that, one of the questions I really want to kind of present to all of our listeners is that this is a field that we all get into for a passion. We start looking at the research, we start looking at the treatment because there's something about autistic disorder and about the patient or the children, the adults that are working through some of the challenges or excelling around some of the exceptions that brought us to this field. So what sparked your interest?
A lot of it was, it really came about later in life. I had the opportunity in high school to interact with a lot of people in the arts, always wanted to figure out what I wanted to do. And at first I thought I wanted to be an elementary education teacher. So I went to school for that and I really loved it. I loved, learning about young kids developing and playing with each other and just having a fun time. When I was in school, though, for college, I got really interested in the biology, thinking, how do our brains develop? What's different about us? And I wasn't even thinking about autism at the time. This was mid-90s. And I started taking classes and getting into research, and I had the opportunity to go into a lab, and I really started thinking about what is it that gets me excited about science. And I was so curious about the brain. I just want to know how the brain develops and how it works. So luckily I got accepted into grad school at Case Western in Cleveland, Ohio, and I just absolutely loved the neuroscience department there. And it really started to make me think about differences in diseases and things like this. And I thought, what perfect thing to study other than how our brains are different in autism. So that's what really sparked my interest. And I think what really got me the opportunity was going to University of California, San Francisco, where I had a wonderful mentor that allowed me to actually start studying genes that were implicated in autism.
I think that, the study of the brain itself is one thing. The genetic piece is a whole different world. But as you went through the journey at Case Western and on your way to UCSF, is the idea of how the brain functions is there are going to be ways with any of us where, our brain functioning helps us to excel in certain areas and creates some barriers that we need to be able to work through. Mm-hmm. Are some of those items, what did you learn about autistic disorder in specific that you started to see, there's some differences here that are causing for some of the exceptions for what we would have labeled neurotypical at that point?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you're right. It's, all of us are going to develop a little differently, but the way I like to think of it is I view it as, our DNA basically is like our recipe book. It's all of our organs are going to use it a little differently, but we have to follow the recipe basically. And our brains do that really well. As they're developing though, I think what I learned really early on is that there's a balance. The brain doesn't just fire a bunch of information constantly. There's both excitation and inhibition, and these two have to be really well balanced in the brain for our functions to be appropriate. And when there's a misbalance, that is really where we start to see things like neuropsychiatric symptoms. I think one of the first things that my mentor at UCSF got really interested in is why is there an elevated rate of epilepsy and seizures? And that that's the perfect example of this imbalance. There's too much excitation in the brain. And does that cause autism symptoms, or is it a symptom of autism itself? We're still not really sure about that. But yeah, I think the key is balance, and how do we develop that balance, and how do the genes instruct, everything to be balanced and work together well?
Well, maybe we can break down some of those terms then. I mean, when you think about excitation, what would that look like? Not only in the brain itself, but also maybe in somebody's behavior or thought patterns. I mean, what does excitation create for us that's maybe more visible for a parent?
Yeah, think about our senses. So our brain has to both interpret the world and then act upon it. And when we say excitation, what we're really thinking about, just with seeing the world, is light comes in, it basically turns on our neurons so they can tell the next neuron in the chain to basically get excited for a little bit and send this message. And it's that message that gives us perception. But excitation alone, if you think about it, if that stimulus was always on, you would see the same picture constantly. So something has to come in and also turn it off so the next frame in the movie can play. Otherwise, you're just going to have a still that you're looking at. And so each time our neurons our brains get excited in different areas, that's what leads to the sensory. And then we can choose to act on that by sending excitation basically from our nerves to our muscles and having that act upon it. When excitation is not balanced in different areas of the brain, say in your motor area or in your visual area, with autism, there's also an elevated sensory experiences. And we're thinking that in places like auditory, where you're hearing or visual, you may not be able to dampen down some of these signals. So it might be a little too much to take in when a normal stimulus for someone else is perceived.
So, I mean, just even what you might see in some of the presentations with autism disorder, where somebody is pulling away from an environment, is that this could potentially be part of their genetic profile, is that, there's a lot of excitation going on, there's a lot of input, there's so much arousal, and that the only way to be able to remove it is to figure out some coping mechanisms to withdraw from what's occurring. And this is the whole idea of how the brain functions is fascinating. But when you're meeting with families, and a lot of times families hear the what to do, what's the next step? What is treatment? What am I going to be doing to work on things? But the why is important. And when you're talking to a family, does some of this click as far as like, hold on, well, now I understand a little bit more about why my child might be covering their ears more frequently, or might be a little bit more tangential in thought. Like, does this help to paint a picture for them?
I think the more knowledge, the better. And the families I've interacted with, they really do want to understand and know as much as they can. I find too, like, learning from other families, every little anecdotal thing that you encounter or see, tell your doctors, tell researchers, because we learn a lot from the parents as well. And it helps us put what we're doing into context. But yeah, it's our encounters here have been really good. We have a children's hospital right next to us that diagnoses, a lot of monogenic disorders and other neurodevelopmental issues here. And really just knowing if it's genetic or not, just knowing what the mutation is sometimes is a big deal, because then it gives them a little more ability to try to figure out what is the next step.
And our field in general, when you're looking at the whole domain of those that are involved with the treatment for autistic disorder, is that one of the biggest hallmarks is that we should all be strength-based. And I would imagine some of the understanding of the gene's effect on neurology and how the brain functions is that as clinicians, even, you can kind of see, these are potential strengths. These are barriers. What are some of the strengths that could come from some of these genetic differences that might help somebody in parts of their development or parts of their engagement in the world around them?
That's a great question because, again, knowledge is power, I think. If you actually, and the good thing that I've noticed since being here is it's getting cheaper and cheaper to do this, since now some insurance companies are also helping out. Genetic testing is becoming a lot more common. But say, for example, you go into the clinic and you're diagnosed with autism, you also have seizures and some other issues. If you come back, so there's some mutations that might come back, and there actually might be FDA-approved drugs for them. That's a big thing that we're getting into now. There's certain signaling pathways. So in all of our cells, there are different proteins that come out of this recipe book, our DNA, and some of them are in families that do the same thing. So for example, there's a family of proteins that regulate this this kinase called mTOR. And I know I'm getting jargony here, but mTOR is really important for cellular growth, synapse formation. A lot of the things that make a brain basically rely on mTOR. And it's very important during growth, but then it has to be shut off in adulthood. Because you don't want to overgrow once you've made it to what you should be as an adult. The thing though is there are inhibitors to this pathway, and there's trials right now. They're looking when to deliver mTOR inhibitors into animals, and there's hope that stuff like this, repurposed drugs, might be something that you can use. But the first step in that is actually knowing if you have a genetic mutation. And once you know that, you can start understanding. That's where like my lab and others come in. We try to figure out what these genes do, and if there's anything that can regulate them. And if there is, as that knowledge builds, we'll hopefully get better and better at this and find therapeutics.
The direct relation to the child's life, from what I'm hearing right now, is that it is information, it is guidance, it is giving you potentially a profile of, these are the possibilities. So yes. If you're seeing this genetic profile of a specific, and maybe we'll get into some of the profiles that make more sense, but you see a specific profile, it might be one that you're saying, hey, you know what, you might be at risk for seizures, you might be at risk for other medical conditions that maybe we should be aware of. Maybe we should start some form of treatment that gives us an option to be able to reduce that risk over time. Are those the conversations? Are those what your research right now is kind of delving into and moving in that direction? Is, what's next?
That's a lot of what we're doing right now. So we study, my lab actually studies a lot of the genes that are involved in this mTOR pathway. We're trying to figure out the extent to which they act inside cells so that we can first understand what could manifest and what brain regions are really critical. And then can they be treated with this rapamycin or its analogs that have come out. But what we're also doing is we're trying to understand the genes that don't have a lot known about them. For example, there's a gene called WAC. It is I would call it the most generic Lego piece of all the proteins, because it has two parts to it that can interact with other proteins, but otherwise we don't really know what it does. And I just met with the families not too long ago in St. Louis for their second clinic, and a lot of the questions they ask are, what do we know? What does it do? What is next? What should we expect? And we're all trying to work together. And I learned just as much from them. I hope that they learned from me. And it was a really good experience. But yeah, a lot of the unknowns were there. But one of the things we did was try to show them where we were at in the research. And we recently did a technique called single cell RNA-seq. Basically, this is where we go into the brain and we can tell what cell types are there and then what recipes they're making. And we basically came up with a list of like 50 or 60 recipes, that were not being made the right way, to put it in my favorite chef's analogy here. But because of that, we now have targets that we know are altered in these the WAC mutants that we made. And because of that, we now know that some of these are druggable and have FDA targets. So what we're doing right now, I have a student in my lab who's actually trying to take those targets, first validate where in the brain they are changed. Because right now we have a list of cell types, but we don't know exactly where the cell types are situated in the brain. And then if we can find these areas, can we treat them with FDA-approved drugs that will get into the brain to see if we can rescue any of our the phenotypes we have in our animal model.
I think that, I mean, as you're describing a lot of that, it's and because I have a lot of conversations with folks that are wonderful self-advocates or advocate for their children, I think, and this is where I'd love for you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that the delineation that I see is that the work being done on genes and even some of the gene therapies is not one that is, I want to change who this person is. I want to change how they perceive the world or how they interact with the world. But it's more on what could be causing major disruption or medical sort of components that, we can start to therapeutically look at, or that you engage with the caretaker or the recipient of the treatment to say, what are the things that we can help to support with through this process? Is that where gene therapy is going? Because we could go in a different tangent, because I think that as a society, sometimes we kind of start thinking, well, the worst case scenario is that I'm trying to reconstruct a whole person and what they're doing. I don't think that's what you're describing.
No.
But am I on the right path with?
You're totally right. Yeah, our main concern are actually getting at the things that disrupt their lives. So the big one is epilepsy and seizures. That's one we really want to find targets for. Other ones are just any type of behavior that could hurt someone or aggression. So those are kind of the things that we're really looking out for in these. That's what we're hoping the gene therapies are really there for. I think we're probably not here yet, but like focal delivery of genes is probably possible, but delivery has always been an issue to do this. But yeah, again, it goes back to, can we figure out where in the brain and when in the brain some of these behaviors that could hurt a person are arising, and then try to treat that.
Well, I might be wading into the technical world right now, so you're gonna have to make sure that I understand the kind of what we're talking about as well. But you're also doing specific research on the P10 gene, and that has some significant understanding of the effects on the child's development. Mm-hmm. Can you give a little bit of background on that? Because when you're talking about, brain development, you're talking about which parts of the brain are most important. I would imagine that this research is guiding a lot of that as well.
Yeah, so my lab and a lot of others have looked at P10 for a very long time. P10, if you can imagine an assembly line that builds a product, P10 is at the very first step almost. What P10 does is it's like the stop to the pathway. And this pathway that I'm talking about is one that builds things in the cell so it can grow, it can migrate, it can form synapses. But the real key here is growth. So, and this is the mTOR pathway again. So P10 stops mTOR pathway from being active. But when the pathway is active, your cells are dividing, they're getting bigger. When they send out their processes, their axons and dendrites, they get bigger in the cell. So almost everyone I know that has worked on P10, if you get rid of P10 or you mutate it, it allows the pathway to be overactive, and therefore your cells grow really big. And one of the consequences of this is a lot of individuals diagnosed with a P10 mutation have a larger head size or megacephaly. And a lot of it is just this overgrowth. This is something that we see in a lot of the other genes in the pathway as well. So you just get this overgrowth in certain areas of the brain. The overgrowth that we think is happening in P10 has to do with the excitatory neurons. We think that might be part of what is causing the large heads. We've looked at it with inhibitory cells. That's something my lab studies a lot of, but we don't see that. But they're really good at kind of getting into where the other cells are and kind of hanging out with them, but not really forming the big structures of the brain.
And I think that, I mean, when you're talking about excitation and you're talking about cell growth and everything that goes with that, is that parents are going to walk away trying to figure out all of this information and how it applies to their everyday life. You've given some good examples on, epilepsy. You've kind of clarified that, what you might see is hyperarousal or hypoarousal, depending on kind of what sort of stimuli are affecting. And what we thought a lot of this was behaviorally oriented. You're seeing more of a genetic impact. Are there environmental conditions that activate any of these genes? Because I would imagine some of these genes exist in people not diagnosed with autistic disorder as well and aren't contributing in the same way that you're describing, or at least to the same level.
Yeah, that is a great question. Environment does play a major role. I think we're still learning a lot about it. I have a colleague here that actually that's his main avenue of study, is understanding how environmental things like pollution, for example, actually converge in people's bodies on some of these genes. And actually his research has, I think, shown that there are some really high confidence autism genes that are influenced by environmental factors. So it comes down to, I think, there can be a lot of causes that come to autism, but there has to be somewhere in the body where they converge. And I think the genes are probably one of the major parts.
Yeah, and I mean, I would imagine that the benefit of being at such a well-supported research environment is the fact that you all are able to collaborate. So you take your research, he's doing his research. Eventually, these things get combined into larger studies, and that you start to learn more and more. But even right now, is that there's those practical insights that lead to real life changes or real life examples or potential changes that we can start exploring. When you've met with families, because you're doing the research, but you're also doing the follow-up and kind of getting their feedback, I'm sure, is what sort of real life examples does the understanding of one's child, I mean, what does that lead to for the family? What's their feedback?
It's a good question, because for a lot of individuals right now, we don't have good treatments, and that's been one of the most frustrating things. And we all know that research takes a while, so it feels very slow to get answers sometimes. Other families where I have seen an effective therapy come through, it's been amazing. There's another situation here of a lab that studies childhood cancers. And because of that, they've worked out and they've been a part of a team that has figured out, again, the pathway that's necessary here. And they have, again, a drug that crosses into the brain that inhibits the pathway. Well, they found out that this particular patient had a mutation in one of the key genes that drives the pathway. And they were actually able to effectively recruit the patient. And after they knew the mutation, the clinician and the basic researcher here worked together to actually provide this treatment. I think they just enrolled another one or two, and it was very effective. So those are the ones that I really love thinking about, because it is possible. But it really takes all these teams coming together. You have to know the basic science. Sometimes you have to know that a therapy is going to work with that science, and then you have to identify a mutation or something else in a patient. Like if it is environmental, is there a panel we can work up that will tell us what's going on and have an effective therapy? But I have hope, because it's one of these things where I've seen it work. But again, there's so many that don't have it yet, and I would really like to get there. But yeah, it's frustrating though, I think, just to know the mutation, but know there may not be much to do about it right now. But I hope in the future we do have better answers as the science progresses.
Yeah, I mean, that's where all these studies start from. It's gathering all the information and understanding it all. And I think that we've done a much better job at being able to recruit more and more people to help with the understanding of everything that's occurring genetically, or even in other realms of treatment. One of the questions I think that immediately comes to my mind is that you're describing a lot of, some of the very specific things that have value to understand at the moment. And I'm going to keep defaulting back to the fact that, there is a pretty high rate of epilepsy amongst some of the autistic profiles. Would there be specific, presentations that you'd say, if you're seeing this, it's worth going in and doing a genetic screening now, even though there's not the information, because you're going to learn a lot at the moment just because of what you're seeing as a parent right now?
I would, especially if the insurance can cover it. And epilepsy, definitely, because there's a lot of, I think a lot of the children that have been diagnosed here have epilepsy, seizures, things like that. That's one I would just check, because a lot of the things that can cause epilepsy, these are like little pores on our cells that allow chemicals in and out. If you know what it is, then we can probably predict what type of anti-seizure medication is going to work best for you. Of course, some of them won't react, and I can tell you a story later about what I think is cool about a new therapy coming out. But I think the biggest thing, though, is you could spend years, getting a diagnosis or getting treated and never know. And the clinicians I've talked to here in our children's hospital have told me it might be better just to get that off of the table. Just do the genetic test now rather than spend years trying to figure out, all your symptomatology and what it is you might possibly have. Because if the test comes back and the mutation tells you a certain gene, it's going to educate everyone, including the clinicians, on how to provide better treatment.
And that education piece, I think, is so important. When I'm thinking of how many ways that genetics can inform, hopefully over time,
yeah,
you're talking on, you've already discussed med management, but you're also talking on, the typical treatments as far as what you're seeing with applied behavior analysis, is that if that clinician can understand a little bit more of the profile of who they're working with, guess what? They're going to be able to make better decisions, make better gains, and the treatments can be better. You see that in school. If you know that, somebody their brain is processing information in a different way, well, you change the way that you're teaching to that individual. You're not going to necessarily always change the person, but it gives you insight. Where do you see the field going? Where do you see genetics being able to help the most in the future? Or is it this whole plethora of everything that's out there?
Oh, it's a great question. There's a few things. Something we're still struggling with is there is just a growing number of difficult to diagnose mutations. So if you think about it again as a recipe, each one of these genes, if someone tears off half the page, that the recipe is not going to be made. And that's easy to predict. But if someone changes a single letter, we don't know what's that going to do. Like, is a cookie still going to taste like a cookie, or have you changed a chocolate chip to a raisin cookie? And that's what we really need to figure out. We've designed, and other people have designed, ways to start screening these mutations so that they have an identity to them. But when a clinician looks them up, they're called VUs, variants of uncertain significance. I probably got that name wrong, but that's basically what it is. It means we don't know. So that's a frustrating thing. And most of the mutations that I've seen in several of the autism genes I've looked at, or autism risk genes, are these VUs. So we really want to give an impact to the mutation, because it can do one of three things. Either the mutation does nothing. We found that a lot of them actually cause the protein to lose some type of function. So it's almost like you've lost. It's almost like you've lost the gene function anyway. But you can also have some that give it a new function, and that's what we want to screen out to understand that, because you're going to treat a person differently if you think they've lost an important protein or if they've gained too much of a function of that protein. And that's really something that we still need to figure out. The other big one is if we want to replace genes in certain areas of the brain to try to treat things like epilepsy, we need good delivery methods. Viruses can work, but the body might build up antibodies and reject that if you try a second round of delivery. So we're looking for better methods. I think we just had a great interesting revolution with the COVID vaccines using mRNA. But every year we get better and better at trying to figure out how to deliver genetic material. And it's holding promise. There's things like blood disorders and even eyes are being targeted right now because they're a little more easy to access than the brain. But I think as they work out the quirks in these other systems, it's going to get better and better with delivery products.
There's so much that we can learn and so much more information that's just going to strengthen the science. Mm-hmm. I have something that I kind of want to move us down a little bit before we wrap up, but
yeah.
When I'm thinking about, and I'm going to verge away from the diagnosis of autistic disorder, and I'm going to talk about anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD. A lot of these are treated with psychopharmaceuticals. Yes. And I would imagine is that there is a genetic component to how these drugs are going to work in effect in the body that we need to understand. Is there study? Is there research? Are you working on anything that is looking at, when we're talking about treatment of some of these comorbid conditions that often align with autistic disorder, that we can understand med management that much better to say, this would be the right anxiety medication because we understand this genetic profile?
That is a great question. Actually, that's one of the things my colleague, Dan Campbell here does. I know that there is an active study that he's working on currently looking at how kids respond to risperidone. And one of the ideas is that if you have enough samples, you might be able to understand if there's certain genetic profiles or certain backgrounds that might respond better than others. So it is a thing. It is being studied. It probably is going to show that some genes that we have are either going to make it better or worse. And it's one of those. I think we need a lot of samples to really get a good answer. But yes.
I mean, I guess I'm always hopeful is that we're going to get to a world where we can be even more efficient with our care models. And a lot of things with treatment and therapy is, I need to try something and I need to learn from that, even in the course of treatment. But the more research we can get prior to, the more accurate we're going to be on our first recommendation, our first prescription, our first chance at being able to help support somebody. Where can people get involved? I mean, you're doing some research, and I would imagine outside of the areas that you have specific clinics that are gathering that, is that not many people are able to access or to be involved with this on a regular basis. Where can people go to look to say, hey, you know what, I want to be a part of the information gathering, or I want to potentially involve myself in some of these treatments that are out there?
Oh, that's a great question. And it's true. We go to work and we do our science and we don't get out much, but we do want to communicate that we're here. You can email us. A lot of us have web pages where you can find us. You can ask us questions. If I don't get all the list out today, email a local scientist. You can go to your research university and search up what we do and find us. On the broader scale, if you wanted to get involved in studies or get more information, I'm part of the Autism Research Institute based in San Diego. That's a great group of people that fund research, but also provide a lot of stories and information. The Simons Foundation based in New York does a lot of the genetic studies that led to a lot of what we know right now. They really funded a lot of that. They do recruit people for trials, and they've had a lot of ongoing. They have if you search up Simons Foundation, you can look at a lot of their autism research as well. And there's several other foundations as well. Autism Speaks was a good one, and then there's a few. I can't think of all of them off the top of my head right now, but yes, there are definitely foundations out there with a lot of family involvement too. And so their meetings are great. You can again contact them, get information, and they do recruit and have great websites.
And with the rate of autistic disorder and the diagnostics rates continuously becoming more prevalent, I think even if it doesn't affect us today, there's chance down our lineage that, somebody in our great grandchild or our great great grandchild, or it's going to hit home at some point for a lot of families. And one of the ways you can contribute now is simply being a part of any of the research opportunities to bring more knowledge to the field. I want to make sure that you have a little bit of a chance to kind of maybe get us thinking or provoke some other additional ideas. What would you be telling us as a field, as clinicians, as parents, that this is the value, this is where we need to be going. These are some future ideas that maybe we should start exploring. Do you have, kind of last thoughts on some of that?
I do. Well, first understand that we're all in this together. I absolutely love meetings where I get to meet families and hear, their take on things and just be able to communicate. Reach out to us too. If you come across a paper and it's too jargony or it's hard to understand, reach out to us. We'll talk with you and explain it to you. Just give us time to respond to the email because we get a lot of those, but we'd be happy to. In terms of going forward, I think in the last decade or so, there's been an amazing number of genes studied. We have more information now than we ever have before, and I think that's only going to grow. The thing I'm really looking forward to are starting to see more translational, like clinical routes and things that could actually treat people. And a lot of this is because of like drug repurposing, and it's very specific sometimes to the disorder, the syndrome that might be involved with autism. Another one that I'll shout out because I think it's coming to light very soon. A paper just came out on this, but even though so the interneurons that we work on are really interesting because when you put them into a brain, you can actually collect them or make them in a dish and then put in like a cell transplant into a brain. At least in rodents, these seem to be very effective at integrating into our brain circuits and quelling down any overexcitation. So overexcitation is something someone has in addition to autism or even other disorders like epilepsy. These cells might be really good for this. So two groups that I know have done it. One has taken pig cells, pig inhibitory interneurons, and put them into sea lion. I think it's a sea lion. It might be, but its name is Cronut. It's a great story. And these cells actually got rid of the seizures in this model. This is Scott Baraban's lab at UCSF. They did an amazing job. But the reason I bring this up is, cellular therapy might be something in the future as well. And then it would matter. That would be more of a treatment rather than a genetic therapy. You wouldn't have to go out and find a drug for a gene. And there might be 100-something genes out there. This one, if 30 of the genes lead to epilepsy, maybe cell transplants would be something in the future. But it's still early days. There's a company now too that's trying it in clinical trials, just trying to see if they're safe. We still have a lot to learn about the cells and how to make them. But if it works, it's great because that's a way of like permanently fixing the circuit and making it calm down and not be too excitable. So I'll leave it at that because I think it's really cool.
I know, and it is. Oftentimes is that this is so far out of my realm of my direct understanding that just even hearing about these advancements is exciting to know about, but it's can be scary at times just knowing, okay, so what does this mean? Where do we go next? But it sounds like the way that it's going through the research world, it's well thought out. People are thinking about, what is it that what's the intent? What are the possible kind of next steps? What is it that could go that we need to make sure that we're accounting for so that nothing goes wrong with any of this? And those are the safeguards that I love about the research system, is that it puts those in place so that we can really understand before moving too quickly. I love all the work that you all are doing. And I think that as clinicians, the more that we can understand it, the better we're going to get at being able to utilize our treatments better. So I appreciate you coming on today, Dr. Vogt, and giving us the opportunity to learn from your research and your knowledge set. And hopefully I can start grabbing some of these papers, and you might get some emails from me asking me for, hey, can you bring down the jargon? But I appreciate it.
Really appreciate you having me on. Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to Autism Weekly. We hope you tune back in next week to learn more about autism in the real world. Autism Weekly is now found on all the major listening apps, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, Amazon Music, and more. Subscribe to be notified when we post a new podcast. Autism Weekly is produced by ABS Kids. ABS Kids is proud to provide diagnostic assessments and ABA therapy to children with developmental delays like Autism Spectrum Disorder. You can learn more about ABS Kids and the Autism Weekly podcast by visiting abskids.com. Thanks for tuning in. See you again next week.